Thank you for tuning in to Growing Tech Fast, the condensed Org3D podcast in which conversations about growing tech startups are had with those who have grown them. Today, I'm joined by Harrison Hochman, founder and CEO of Sparrow. Harrison, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. So as you mentioned, my name is Harrison Hochman. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO at Sparrow. Quick background about myself, born and raised in California. I went to Stanford for 2 degrees, which is where Sparrow was actually started, and very excited to have this conversation.
Brilliant, thank you. So, I'd love to know, you said it started while you were at college. Tell me how Sparrow came about.
Sure. So at the turn of COVID, I and a handful of my friends, students across the nation, got sent home from college. And during that time, a lot of families' adjusted gross income dropped. They weren't making as much money, but the expected cost at university didn't change. And so that gap had to be filled by something. It was filled by private student lending. And watching my friends go through this process as a student, I saw how unbelievably antiquated the process was when trying to search for the right private student loan. You know, you'd go onto Google and you'd search best student loans 2021, enter. Maybe you'd come across some arbitrary articles with a vague star rating, like 4.7 stars out of 5, but there was no actionable information when you're making what is, we consider, the second largest financial decision of your life, that being behind a mortgage. And so we thought that the type of automation which exists in travel didn't exist in private student lending. So if I wanted to go from myself right now in New York back home to Los Angeles, I wouldn't go to JetBlue, Southwest, American, and Delta individually to ask them for the price of an airline ticket. I would just go to Kayak, Google Flights, or Expedia. I would punch in my dates, my departure, and my arrival, and then they would go and price those airline tickets for me automatically. The same level of convenience didn't exist for my friends when they were trying to search for the best private student loan. So we took 14 months and we built that. But largely the inception came from a personal problem that we saw, experienced, and essentially just built a product for our friends.
So just for the people listening in, to understand the situation a little bit further, as not all of our audience are based in the US. So when, of course, this situation happened to you and your friends during the pandemic, but how many students are looking at private student loans as a whole in the US?
Sure. So private student lending in the United States is an industry. The reason that's the case is you got to look at how a student ends up coming up with the between $20,000 and $70,000 a year that it costs to attend college. Again, depending on which college you attend, if it's a public school versus private, in school versus out-of-state resident. And so what happens is a student will start by saying, I'm going to submit a form. It's going to go to the federal government. That form's called FAFSA. And what FAFSA does is it qualifies you for federal aid, usually a Pell Grant. And then if you can't qualify for Pell, you look toward, or if you do and it doesn't cover your total need, you'll apply for federal loans. Federal loans are great so long as they're subsidized. Subsidized means that the federal government pays your interest while you're in school, and they have great protection on the back end. So if you need to put your loan into forbearance, they'll allow for that. So after you've exhausted Pell, grants, scholarships, work study, and federal loans, students will still come up with this gap of finances that they personally can't cover, they can't come out of pocket for. That's where private student lending sits. And to just slap some numbers behind it, in 2020, the private student loan volume for that specific year, even during a pandemic, was $16.8 billion in 1 year, growing at 8.6% a year. So it's an industry, it's the gateway to help students attain education when they can't afford it independently. And it's a huge problem that we at Sparrow are trying to solve.
And of course, this occurred as in the thought for Sparrow came about during COVID, but as we move out of the pandemic, and talking about, as you've just mentioned, kind of a private student loan crisis in itself, what would this mean for students who those first options are very limited. How can Sparrow tackle that for those individuals?
Mm-hmm. So the best way to frame it is to put yourselves in that seat of a student who does need $20,000 and they have absolutely no other avenue to find that source of capital. That student is going to do that Google search. They're going to come to some search engine and try and find these articles about lenders that in 20 years won't be predatory or usury when they originate their loan. And this student is in a particularly vulnerable state. It's the choice between borrowing the money and not getting a college education. And so they're very, very open and exposed to someone acting maliciously. Now, what happens with Sparrow is we come in as that helping hand. We come in as the search engine of last resort. So we come in and say, hey, you don't have to immediately turn to the lender brand that you recognize. Come to us, and for free, it won't affect your credit score. We will exhaustively search the market of lenders all across the nation, big and small, massive names like Sallie Mae, all the way down to state-based nonprofits and credit unions. And we'll exhaustively search that market for you after you've submitted your request in under 35 seconds, and then help you think through how to select a repayment plan that makes sense for you. And we can get into the complexities of selecting repayment plans. It's actually a very important consideration. But that's where we come in and how we drive value is we let students know that in this moment of vulnerability, they still have options and there's a way to efficiently find them.
I love that. I think the concepts behind Sparrow is it's compelling from like somebody who's also been a student. I know that there are lots of people who would have loved to have gone to college at that time, and it maybe just didn't feel like there were any options for them. So to be able to have that door opened, not just for people who are able to consider college anyway, but it might ease their situation at home financially, or those who just thought it was completely off the cards for them. I love that Sparrow is going to give them that option. But rewind a couple of years, you were a graduate yourself, you're now a CEO. What's that journey like been for you as an individual? What challenges did you overcome? Are there any of them that you're still tackling?
Sure. Many. I would say first and foremost is you don't really start with a title. You just start with a problem and you build a solution that you think would be valuable for you. And then eventually it's valuable for your friends. And it slowly starts broadening beyond that to being valuable for other students at your university. And slowly but surely, you look at a solution that's now valuable nationwide. And I think the progression for us has been very natural. We've had many stumbling blocks, more setbacks than I can count. And I think that the true meaning of, at Sparrow, for example, internally, I just refer to everybody as WIT. It's whatever it takes. So you leave your stripes at the door. But in terms of progressing into a manager, I think the most important thing is to understand what you don't know and lean on those who do have expertise. So, I will never be the most experienced technically. I will never have the most experience in the student lending industry. I'll never have the most experience in marketing, but we hire and bring on team members that do. And so for the decisions that require that level of expertise, understand when to step back and rely upon and trust their judgment as being better than yours, I think is an incredibly effective tool for trying to bring together individuals to synergistically create something special. Yeah,
creating a truly collaborative environment.
Exactly.
So I can't imagine, as it is such a important, but as you've mentioned previously, large industry, that there aren't some competitors on the market. Why Sparrow? If you're a student listening in now or a potential student, why should they download Sparrow over other apps who are doing a similar thing?
Sure. Great question, by the way. So what I would say first and foremost is our exhaustive network. It's the size of the number of the institutions that we work with. So Sparrow has the most coverage of any solution out there. If you want to be confident that you've seen all the various options that exist, that's what we do. We provide that optionality and that coverage. So first things first is let's get the network in place to provide this student with as broad of a search as possible. Step two, and the value prop to this student is once you do have those offers, ask yourself a simple question. If I presented you with with one offer, with a repayment plan at a 3.5% fixed APR on a 10-year term, and a 4.5% variable APR on a 5-year term, would you understand which of those repayment plans to select for that loan? Probably not.
No.
And by the way, you're in good company. Neither did I. And so when you're doing it and trying to make that consideration, there's a handful of various sophisticated mathematical equations and techniques and spreadsheets that you can try and put together to make an educated decision. Well, at Sparrow, we've built out these proprietary tools to make the apples to apples comparison of repayment plans personalized to you, visual and intuitive and digestible. And so if you try and take a step back and say, why should you come to Sparrow versus any other competitor? First things first is we'll just find you more options. And chances are by finding you more options, those options will be more affordable. But the second step is saying, all right, now that I have those options, how do I make a confident borrowing decision? How do I understand that this is the right repayment plan for me? There's no support currently beyond Sparrow in the market for this decision. You'd probably consult some financial aid advisor or try and break out a spreadsheet from an article that you saw on some blog. But on Sparrow, we'll do that math for you. And so I like to think of those two steps as our North Star, because those are the two largest considerations when you're trying to find the right private student loan.
So moving into the future, of course, at this current moment in time, everybody, although at different paces, is moving out of the pandemic. So the elevated issue of this will, I imagine, slightly alleviate as we go further out of the pandemic. But what do you think, moving out of the pandemic, how will that impact the private loan crisis and Sparrow itself?
I think it will only exacerbate. One of the largest expenses that students have during a year is room and board. Right now in a virtual environment, they're living at home. There's no reason to be on campus or on off-campus housing. And so when you get back to school and you need to cover that cost, as we've discussed, the place where that cost is being covered from is some private lender. They're coming up with those funds. So that's the first thing, is private student lending, in my view, will start to balloon as students move back on campus. On the refi sense, there has been a forbearance policy where a vast majority of borrowers across the nation don't have to repay their federal student loans, which is the vast majority of student loan volume out there currently in repayment. It's in what's called forbearance. Forbearance simply means, interest is not accruing and I don't have to make those monthly payments. Well, the forbearance pause might get extended. It's supposed to end on May 1st. It might extend for a few more months. But as we come out of the pandemic, the expectation is that the forbearance period will end. And so as the forbearance period ends, suddenly you have a reason to refinance that debt, presumably at a lower APR from a private lender. And so Sparrow does both things. We help students find in-school lending, that's called private student loans. But on the out-of-school front, we also help young adults refinance their loans at lower rates and more affordable repayment plans.
And I guess to dive a little deeper into that question, with inflation at a high, people aren't in the same financial situation as they were pre-COVID, which will only increase this problem that you've just mentioned. But we don't know how that inflation issue is going to be solved over the next 6-12 months. What's your envision for the next couple months, next year, 2 years? What do you think is going to happen in a more general sense? And then tell me a bit about what's going to happen for Sparrow.
Sure. So as inflation pertains to student loans, I think the most important thing to look at is the rate of change of the average APR in private markets and then also what the APR is set by Congress on federal loans. Fun fact is Congress actually sets the APR for federal loans, both subsidized and unsubsidized. On the private side, lenders each month update their rates. And so what to look out for is those rate changes. You know, when we were in the heat of the pandemic, rates were at an all-time low. And so it was actually a fantastic time to refinance your loans if you were in a position to do so, because you could refinance them at historically low rates. Well, as that changes and rates start increasing, I think we're going to have a rate hike sometime next month. The rates for private student lending, but also for student loan refinancing, will start to increase. So I don't know crystal ball. I have no idea where it's going, but I can say that the value of a technological solution like Sparrow will, in my opinion, be ever increasingly valuable as rate variability and uncertainty increases, because there may be some lenders who are able to keep that APR constant, whereas others are reflective of the market. You'll have no idea until you search for them. How do you efficiently search for them? That's on Sparrow.
So given that, what's in store for Sparrow over the next 12 months? What you can tell me.
Sure. So what's in store for Sparrow? Well, we've got a handful of great updates coming. First things first is we're continuing to broaden our network of financial institutions with which we pre-qualify on behalf of. What does that mean practically for borrowers? It means that you'll just get more qualified and affordable offers from various financial institutions. Why this is important is because Sparrow wants to get to the point such that regardless of who you are, if you're a US citizen or an international student and you can't even find a US-based cosigner, for a quick digression on cosigners are people that guarantee your loans. They're very important in private student lending because young adults don't have credit history. So regardless if you're a US citizen or an international student who can't find a US-based cosigner, we want you to have options on Sparrow. Trying to solve for that is a very difficult problem. What it involves is trying to find these niche one-off lenders, either internationally or domestically, that can have coverage for those students, go through the compliance process and the technical overhead to integrate into them so that we can introduce them on the Sparrow market. Now, we have the broadest coverage thus far. We're just going to keep our foot on the pedal, and we're going to increase our coverage for borrowers. So I think within that 12-month mark, by the end of December of this year, not only will we continue to have the nation's broadest coverage for private student lending and student loan refinancing, but we'll start to separate ourselves and be in a league of our own. On the repayment side, Sparrow is going to be coming out with, to the extent that I can talk about it, we will be coming out with a pretty compelling repayment product. If you think about the two sides of borrowing, you have borrowing the loan, how you found that loan and ended up taking it on as a borrower. But on the backside is repayment. How do you pay that loan back? And so this same mindset of using technology to efficiently search for loans is going to be used for how do you efficiently pay them back. And there's a variety of features and exciting integrations that we have coming, not too long. So probably within the next couple of months.
Very, very exciting. And I think we've spoken quite a bit about the product and why it's relevant, interesting, and an exciting thing for your customer base and why they should use Sparrow. But to kind of flip the conversation slightly, because I imagine there's going to be a lot of people coming out of university who think, hey, this is a really cool idea. I could use it myself, but also sounds like a great product to work on. So what's great about working for Sparrow?
Sure. I'll talk about it totally from a personal sense. Why is it that everybody at our company gave up incredibly compelling opportunities with huge opportunity cost to come and try and solve this problem? Just to put this in perspective, private student lending and federal student lending, so student loans abroad, there's in America, there is approximately, depending on where you look at your numbers, about $1.7 trillion of outstanding student debt. Now, to put that in perspective, if student loans were the GDP of a nation, student loans in America would be the 11th largest nation in the world. The student loan category is the second largest credit industry in the US behind mortgages. It's the fastest growing credit industry in the US. And so when we talk about getting out of bed to do something big that impacts a lot of people, it's a fantastic North Star to have. And thing two is, because of the regulatory capture of the student loan industry, there's been very little innovation since early 2010s. And so Sparrow sees itself as this technological pioneer trying to use modern technologies and integrations to try and do something that actually matters, and matters for 45 million Americans paying back their loans. So why are we a great place to work? I think the first thing is, like many companies, we say we dream big, but we know exactly why we get out of bed in the morning. Thing two is, we are a talent-dense culture. So, we're very deliberate with who we bring onto the team. And the top thing that we prioritize is passion. We want to see someone who wants it, who wants to tackle this problem and take a level of autonomy and ownership to get it done. And so, by coming onto the team, you will be in a group of like-minded, passionate, talented technologists.
Amazing. I think that's something that I've really enjoyed out of this conversation today, is hearing your passion and your enthusiasm for what you're doing. Of course, most people in a startup who are growing something that they had an idea for have that, but I love that you can hear it. It like oozes out of everything you're saying. It's very, very nice to hear. And I think if anyone who is listening, who you can clearly hear, there is a brilliant product to have a look at, but there's also a very exciting opportunity at a company like Sparrow. So we'll round it up there. I think what would be really great from you is, if there is one thing that the audience listening takes away from this podcast, what would it be?
It's a great question. I pause because I have to think about that. I would say, if there's one thing to take away about Sparrow, it is that we come from the perspective of truly believing that our business empowers the American dream. And a core component of the American dream is education, undeniably. Education enables social mobility. Education enables intellectual curiosity. Education enables a plethora of things that are unbeknownst to me without it. Now, unfortunately, the price of that education is inaccessible for the vast majority of students, both domestically and internationally. It is a non-starter. Sparrow seeks to become the financial engine to make that education accessible and equitable, thereby enabling the American dream. And so if you remember nothing but one thing, it is that that's our North Star, and that's why we feel passionate about what we work on.
I love that. Thank you, Harrison. It's been great having you.
Thank you very much.